Hey, everybody. It is Friday, March 14th, 3/14, Pi Day here. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Winunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And we sometimes celebrate mathematical constants like pi, 3.14159. Some of you know it goes on and on and on and on. It is the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. It's something we all learn in math class at some point, and people like to celebrate it because today is 3.14314, and so it's Pi Day.
So get yourself a pizza pie, a slice of pie, whatever it is you want to celebrate.
Yeah, those are the much more fun pies. I mean, there's like probably math nerds among you that are like really into pie, P-I, but the rest of us, you can celebrate Pi Day, you know, with a good baked good. Apple pie, Jill?
I don't discriminate on pie, and I do think that there are some deals to be had. So look around, because there are some pie places, bakeries, pizza restaurants, etc., that will give you a little bit of a discount today.
Pumpkin pie. Pumpkin pie is always good with whipped cream. Blueberry pie.
Everything's better with whipped cream and vanilla ice cream.
Oh, vanilla ice cream. That's a good one. Jill, the other thing, as people listen to this, likely on Friday morning, some of you might have stayed up last night past 2 a.m. It was a blood moon, a rare celestial event. We will have photos over on the Instagram account for you today, though, for those of you who didn't stay up all night to check out the, effectively an eclipse of the moon. It's basically the Earth gets in between the moon and the sun, and that's what creates this red effect on the moon.
And in terms of the red, as you're mentioning the blood, one scientist explained it. They said it's like if the red light from sunrises and sunsets became visible at the same time. I'd never heard that before.
There you go. If that sounds exciting to you and you really like the pictures, well, you'll have another chance to check out a blood moon. 2026 is the next time we will have a chance to check it out. So you have, well, actually, by the way, that seemed like a far off. We're in 2025. That's next year.
For some reason, when we were talking about it, you said it's 3 years away. And I didn't question it. You're like, it's 3 years away in 2026. And I'm like, yeah,
but,
makes
by the way,
sense.
apologies. One of you noticed yesterday, they're like, Moshe, you know, you do have a tendency to make us millennials and Gen Xers feel old. But yesterday you said Shares Believe turned 36 when it actually turned 26. So I'm sorry I did that to all of you. 1999 was not 10 years ago, but it also was not 30 years ago. It was 26 years ago.
That's a really interesting point, though. Maybe we do age ourselves as sort of like a defense mechanism. Is that possible that we kind of play into being elder millennials, Gen Xers, and the nostalgia as just kind of like embracing the aging process instead of trying to fight it?
Perhaps, Jill. You're asking really deep psychological questions on this Friday.
That's what I do. As I ponder my own age. Well, I guess maybe as a woman, I feel it more than you do. So something you said just sort of touched a nerve.
Well, I clearly touched a nerve yesterday when I accidentally called 1999 36 years ago. So again, apologies for that, folks. That was 26 years ago based on our reading of the calendar.
All right, now to the headlines. Shutdown watch. Funding runs out on Saturday after midnight. Democrats are in a tough position. Do they support the Republican bill or shut down the government?
We'll tell you which direction they're leaning.
Huge changes to U.S. climate policy. What happened to make America healthy again? The Wall Street, the S&P 500 now in correction territory. What that means. Overseas, Russian President Vladimir Putin stopped short of agreeing to a ceasefire, but says he's open to one.
Yeah, open to one on Putin's terms. We'll tell you about his 10 demands.
Back here in the U.S., Columbia University announced some disciplinary action against students who occupied campus buildings last spring.
They really want their $400 million back from the federal government, Jill.
The migrants that were moved to Guantanamo Bay, they're moving back to the United States. What happened?
Yeah, a lot of issues with that plan to send illegal migrants to Gitmo. We'll explain.
Meta taking a page from Twitter or X to test community notes as a way to fact-check posts.
You're a fact-checker, and you're a fact-checker, and you're a fact... We're all fact-checkers now, Jill.
And a great story to end the podcast. A Jeopardy winner with Parkinson's competes in the game show 24 years after his first audition.
It's a nice story, Jill, and so many of us aspire one day to be on Jeopardy, so we'll bring it to you.
Plus, it is Friday. Cheers to the freaking weekend, what we are watching, reading, and eating.
And Jill, after this week, what we're drinking.
I was not expecting that. Okay, starting with the latest on the potential government shutdown. Funding set to run out tonight after midnight. The House, as we have reported, passed a continuing resolution this week to keep the government open until October. But in the Senate, Democrats are holding up the legislation to advocate for a clean 1-month stopgap bill. So they say this would prevent a shutdown and give them a little bit more time to negotiate. That is pretty much a non-starter for Republicans who control both chambers and the White House. So, Moshe, at this point, it does look like Chuck Schumer and the Dems are coming around to a different solution.
Jill, they're throwing in the towel. Democrats were too worried about being blamed for a shutdown here. They realized that while they technically could block it and lead to a shutdown, Republicans in the House, they passed the bill. They went on vacation. They went back to their districts, basically challenging the Democrats to block this. Democrats were discussing, as you mentioned, the stopgap bill, but it appeared very likely starting Thursday afternoon that they're going to go ahead and approve this resolution to keep the government open here. There were a lot of concerns here for Democrats. They were in a tough position. They don't want to be blamed for a shutdown, but they also don't love this bill. It gives Trump a lot of leeway to spend money to reallocate funds as he likes it. Effectively, Democrats were cut out here because they're not in power anywhere. And so Republicans in the House and Republicans in the Senate and Republicans in the White House came up with this and cut the Democrats out. And the Democrats in the House really had no options. In the Senate, voting is different, so Democrats could have blocked this. But ultimately, they've decided, it appears, now anything could still happen as we record this. This is what it appears right now, late Thursday, that they're going to concede here. They're going to keep the government open despite not liking the bill here, the cuts that it makes to various funding priorities, the fact that, again, it gives the president a lot of leeway. But they were also fearful if they shut down the government, what Donald Trump, what Elon Musk could do with the government shutdown. They were scared about the precedent that could set, given the president's attempts to continue to push his power and leverage and do things that, our favorite word on this podcast, are unprecedented. Tina Smith, senator from Minnesota, said, quote, this is effectively Democrats' description, bumper sticker right now. Tina Smith says, we're in a really terrible position. And so that was the challenge here for Democrats. We will watch the vote today, but it appears the government will remain open here, despite Senate Democrats sort of debating what to do.
We're also watching a huge overhaul of the U.S. climate policy. The head of the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, Lee Zeldin, this week announced plans to lift dozens of regulations restricting industries and corporations across the country. He has called it the largest deregulatory announcement in U.S. history. Many of these rules are related to clean air, water, and soil. But in many cases, industries and Republicans view them as onerous and costly. At its core, the EPA is changing its focus from protecting the environment to lowering costs for Americans. Central to the plan is eliminating what Zeldin calls the holy grail of the climate change religion, the endangerment finding. The 2009 endangerment finding gave the EPA legal authority to regulate carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases because scientific evidence showed that they threaten public health and welfare by contributing to climate change. This attempt to take down the endangerment finding likely to be challenged in court, but if it is eliminated, it would unwind 15 years of climate change policy. It requires the EPA to submit evidence that climate change does not pose health, environmental, or economic harms. The EPA also announced that it will target other climate regulations, including CO2 limits for power plants, tailpipe emission standards for vehicles, methane leak restrictions on the oil and gas industry, and mandatory greenhouse gas reporting requirements for large emitters. So, Moshe, basically all of the policies that were passed trying to protect the environment.
Over the last 15 years or so, yeah, based on the endangerment finding, Republicans and conservatives have been against a number of them. The industries themselves, they have been lobbying against these rules, saying they're costing us too much. We don't want them there. But ultimately, the EPA, through the Obama era, through the Biden era, and even through the first Trump era, continued to impose new limits. I mean, there's a lot of evidence showing that dirty air impacts children, impacts the elderly, impacts people with asthma and other folks, as well as, as we're talking about what's in our water, what's in our soil. But industries say, you're making things way too hard. It's too hard to build plants. It's too hard to do this, that, and the other thing. And so ultimately here, you have the EPA getting super aggressive. As you mentioned, they're sort of taking a new tack. Lee Zeldin, very little experience when it comes to, this space, but ultimately doesn't really matter if the EPA here is more about lowering the costs, they say, for Americans, as opposed to finding new ways to protect the environment. And so you have the Trump administration saying, listen, this is about making things cheaper for Americans, and that's what we're focused on here. Environmental advocates, Democrats, and even some Republicans warn that fewer regulations here will result in greater long-term public health issues. So while the cost could go down, and some folks are skeptical of that because as costs go up, they very rarely go down, healthcare costs will go up here. If you start polluting the environment more, people will experience health issues. There'll be some other impacts on society here from increased pollution. And so, as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of lawsuits here from environmental groups that are already prepared for the lifting of these types of regulations. What's key here is going to be this endangerment finding. This is central to what the EPA has been working on over the course of the past 2 decades here. In 2007, the Supreme Court issued a ruling which allowed the EPA to determine whether 6 greenhouse gases endanger the health of current and future generations and that they could be regulated. In 2009, the EPA said, yeah, that's what we found here, and moved ahead with it. So now the EPA will have to argue in court that the science doesn't hold up anymore, that climate change does not have a detrimental impact on people's health. And there's going to be a high bar for them to get there after, several decades of evidence to the contrary there. And so there are some folks who are skeptical that they'll be able to get that through here. But nonetheless, they decided to go for the core thing here. They decided to lift a whole bunch of regulations here, and they're going to be having to deal with that fight in court. In the meantime, the EPA, Lee Zeldin says he's going to be cutting a whole bunch of staff over there that it doesn't need to be as big as it's been. It is notable, Jill, EPA created under which president?
Ronald Reagan.
Close, Richard Nixon, another Republican. If you look at his policies, you take his name off of it, and you look at him today, you're like, oh my God, that was totally a Democratic president. It was Richard Nixon who, in response to growing public concern because of the amount of pollution and other issues in the 50s and 60s, created the EPA to protect human health from the environment. So this is a big pivot here for the EPA. And some people note here, and this certainly will be getting questions at the White House about this, that it comes as the president is promising to make America healthy again, right? You had RFK over at Health and Human Services, talking to the big food companies we talked about on the podcast this week, saying, take out red dye number 3. Let's find out ways to take chemicals out of food. And yet over on the EPA, you're lifting limits on the ability to put chemicals into the air and into the environment here. And as we talk about a variety of things, there's a lot of studies out there, among others, that link air pollution to autism in children. So ultimately here, there will be questions, there will be lawsuits, like many other things that we're watching, but still pretty notable as Republicans here around Lee Zeldin and Trump celebrate the ability to lift a lot of these regulations that they feel are onerous for industry. But Democrats and environmentalists prepare for battle here, saying, please don't undo the progress of the past 20 years.
Now to Wall Street, the S&P 500 has dropped into correction territory on Thursday, sinking below an important symbolic landmark as investors are anxious about President Trump's trade policy and also inflation. The S&P closed at 5,500 points. That's down more than 10% from its record close last month. A correction, by the way, is defined as a fall of at least 10% from a peak. Several other stock indices also are in correction territory. Wall Street has been fretting about the direction of the Trump administration's tariff policies, which have been rolled out sporadically, bewildering investors. Stocks have also been dragged lower by concerns about slower economic growth at a time when inflation still is not as low as policymakers would have hoped. The truth is, corrections do happen every couple of years. We've had 7 corrections in the last 20 years. On average, it takes markets about 3 months to bounce back from a decline of 5% to 10%. Some analysts would say they're a good buying opportunity, but several prominent investment banks have said recently that they think the odds of a recession are getting higher, something we've been discussing, Moshe, here in this podcast. And then there are the warnings from the White House in the last couple of weeks that there's going to be more pain ahead, or what they would call a period of transition when it comes to cutting spending and implementing tariffs that could raise prices for Americans.
Yeah, it's unclear how long this will last, how tough it will be, but we got the latest indication that right now the White House is not relenting here. Trump on Thursday was asked about this, and he doubled down. He says, "I'm not going to bend it all." That was the quote yesterday. "We've been ripped off for years, and we're not going to be ripped off anymore." And he repeated again, "There'll be a little disruption, but it won't be very long." He says, as he seeks to recalibrate the U.S. economy. And it comes as we got the latest indication in the trade war between Europe and the U.S. We told you about those steel and aluminum tariffs, 25% that the U.S. imposed globally in the last 48 hours. The Europeans then yesterday, as we mentioned, added tariffs on U.S. whiskey, U.S. motorcycles, U.S. boats, and a whole bunch of other products coming soon. Now, in response to the whiskey tariff, Trump announced on Friday that he would be imposing 200% tariffs on U.S. imports of European wine, champagne, and other alcohol from the continent. It would effectively cut off Americans from much of Europe's most iconic beverages, like champagne, right? Champagne comes from the Champagne province of France. Now, I guess you could still buy them here, but they will be several times the cost. So Trump is saying, "I will impose that tariff on European liquor unless you take off the whiskey tariff here," as we kind of watch this. Again, we've been saying this tennis match back and forth, back and forth, back and forth.
So you're saying we're going to be stuck with champagne a la Schitt's Creek for anybody who's seen it?
Something like that. The sparkling, we can only make sparkling wine here in America because we don't, have the Champagne province of France. But many people love their European wine. I heard from messages from folks yesterday being like, "Oh my God, I'm running to my local liquor store right now to pick up the stuff that I like."
The good stuff.
The good stuff. The good stuff. And we should mention that that's about $10 billion in exports from Europe to the U.S. In 2024 alone, the U.S. imported $5.5 billion just of wine from the EU. And it also apparently $1 billion worth of European beer, $3.5 billion worth of vodka, gin, and whiskey from Europe. And so, take that, the 10 billion, take a 200% tariff, and you're talking about several times the cost there if tariffs are imposed. Now, we should mention, back in the Trump first term, some of you might remember that he threatened 100% tariffs on French wine and cheese over their plan back then to tax American tech companies. The two sides were able to reach an agreement there. EU wine and spirits have faced tariffs in the past as part of a dispute between Boeing and Airbus. Boeing here in the U.S., Airbus in Europe. We try to protect Boeing. They try to protect Airbus. So there have been a whole bunch of back and forth there. We'd have called a truce on it in 2021. But this appears to be ongoing here and is one of the reasons, as we began this story, that Wall Street is sort of scratching their heads and selling off for now until they have some sense of normalcy or at least some stability coming from Washington.
Time for the speed read. Let's start with some international news. Russian President Vladimir Putin publicly addressing the ceasefire offer for the first time. No surprise, the Russian leader has a few demands before he ends the war. From the New York Times, President Putin on Thursday rejected an immediate ceasefire, making it clear he was in no hurry to agree to a ceasefire and that he wanted to continue negotiating with President Trump. He told reporters Russia was in favor of a 30-day truce, but he's got some conditions, Moshe.
As one would expect from Vladimir Putin.
Mind you, U.S. officials are heading to Russia to talk about that ceasefire proposal that Ukraine's already agreed to. Putin said the idea itself is the right one, and we definitely support it. But there are a few questions that we need to discuss, and I think we need to talk them through with our American colleagues and partners. So what are some of those questions? For one, whether Ukraine would be able to continue receiving arms shipments during that 30-day truce. He, no surprisingly, says no, that arms shipments should stop. He doesn't want any Western countries to serve as peacekeepers. He doesn't want Ukraine to be able to work on its defenses during the ceasefire. Putin also said Russia would not allow Ukrainian forces currently occupying land in Russia to peacefully withdraw. Instead, Ukrainian leadership could order them to simply surrender. Unclear exactly what that means.
Yeah, he keeps stuff pretty vague on purpose. It comes, Jill, as he has been on the offensive of late, has been gaining ground of late. So he's not incentivized to end this war at least anytime soon, as he continues to be able to grab more and more land there in Ukraine, and also finish off that offensive the Ukrainians made to take a piece of Russian territory. Why? Because the Ukrainians wanted to be able to trade the Russian territory for some of the land that Russia has taken from Ukraine. And so Putin's looking at that. He wore camouflage this week, pretty rare for him, went to the front lines and wants to finish that part off before they get to a ceasefire to give Ukraine less leverage during negotiations. So these are going to be terms that are going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to accept here. The Ukrainians are basically being like, well, he wants to set us up for his next round when he takes even more of Ukraine. Now, notably, he did not repeat his demand from last year that Ukraine has to withdraw from its own territory that Russia has declared its own. Remember, Russia has taken about 20% of Ukraine, about the size of Pennsylvania, but there's still more of those various territories they claim as their own. And so they're not demanding that Ukraine withdraw from more of its own territory. So I guess sort of a win there or concession from the Russians. So we're going to see what happens here when Putin meets with Steve Witkoff, the American negotiator here. He's set to be there. Trump called these negotiations very serious discussions yesterday in the Oval Office. He happened to be next to the NATO Secretary General. Trump was asked whether he wants to meet with Putin. He said he would love to meet with Putin and talk with him. So that, we'll continue to watch to see whether Trump and Putin see each other. That's certainly something Trump can give Putin and is a leverage point. We'll see what the Americans get out of the Russians before they agree to allow Trump to see Putin in person there. Either way, Jill, given where we've been at the last couple of weeks, pretty remarkable. The week began here as we hit this Friday with the U.S. and Ukraine and Saudi Arabia, Ukraine agreeing to a 30-day ceasefire, and now an actual conversation being had with the Russians here. But still, the two sides very far apart.
From the New York Times, Columbia University announced on Thursday a range of disciplinary actions against students who occupied a campus building last spring during anti-Israel protests, including expulsions and suspensions. The college is embroiled in crisis after the Trump administration revoked $400 million in grants and contracts for the school's, quote, inaction in the face of persistent harassment of Jewish students. The punishments levied include multi-year suspensions, temporarily revoking degrees, and expulsions. The school did not release the names of the students who would be punished. It is unclear how many students have been punished. A congressional investigative committee has demanded that the university turn over all disciplinary records related to anti-Israel activism. A major protest by dozens of groups is planned for the campus gates today. So not letting up there for Columbia. That interim president has quite the job.
That's the thing. I mean, listen, the federal government playing hardball with Columbia University, and Columbia University realizing it's got to do more here because remember, there's the $400 million in research grants. By the way, most of this money goes because Columbia University has some incredible medical facilities and research facilities working on a number of scientific projects there. But the federal government sees that as leverage, right, in this sort of world we live in. And so Columbia's like, oh, we need to do something because, by the way, there's even more money that the government can pull back from Columbia University. You may have seen the headline the past 24 hours that Johns Hopkins is actually letting go of 2,000 people due to the funding that the government is removing from a whole bunch of universities when it comes to NIH and research grants. Now, the Columbia situation was specific to some of the issues that have happened related to the anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian protests on campus. And so it's not going to let up anytime soon, the activism, given this announcement that students are going to be hoping to reverse this, just like they were able to reverse it last year when the administration there at the university actually tried to do something about the protests. And this all comes as, we're continuing to watch the story we've been telling you about all week, the arrest of anti-Israel activist leader Mahmoud Khalil. He continues to remain in detention at an ICE facility, an Immigrations and Customs Enforcement facility in Louisiana. More legal documents set to be filed today with a federal court. That's where his lawyers are asking for him to be returned home to New York. The federal government, meanwhile, looking to deport him. They say that he broke visa law, broke immigration law by conducting himself in a way that is against U.S. foreign policy, by doing things that are sympathetic to Hamas, a designated terrorist group here in the U.S. Now, his side, his lawyers, his family, the activists say this is a free speech case, and he's being punished for simply criticizing Israel. The other side says, no. He was engaged in activities that disrupted campus, made students feel unsafe, and as a green card holder, still has to follow a whole bunch of rules related to not endorsing a terror group. So Interesting legal case we'll watch here. Jill, every day is an interesting day in New York City, an active day in New York City. A few blocks away from Mo News headquarters over here in Midtown, about 100 people were arrested inside Trump Tower. Now Trump's in Washington, but about 100 members led by a group called Jewish Voice for Peace went into the lobby of Trump Tower, shouting things like "Bring Mahmoud home now," protesting how the government is trying to deport him. And so the NYPD warned them, get out of the lobby. They didn't get out of the lobby, so they arrested about 98 people on various charges: trespassing, obstruction, resisting arrest. But Trump has said this is the first of many arrests to come for people engaged in pro-terrorist, anti-Semitic, anti-American activity. So we'll continue to watch all those developments.
From Fox News, the Trump administration's removed all of the migrants who were being held at the Guantanamo Bay Naval Station in Cuba and has flown them back to the United States. This is according to the Defense Department. The 40 men have been transported back to Louisiana, where there is a U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement facility in Alexandria. It comes 2 weeks after the Department of Homeland Security sends another group of 48 migrants back to the same city from Guantanamo. It is unclear why DHS sent the group of migrants back to the United States after the costly flights to the military base in Cuba. Last week, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth was on hand at Guantanamo when a military C-130 carrying 9 migrants landed at the base. The Defense Department calculates the cost per flight hour to operate a C-130 at about $21,000. So for a trip of 5 to 6 hours, it cost the Pentagon $200,000 to $250,000. That would be round trip, or $23,000 to $27,000 per detainee.
Yeah, so the Trump White House here looking to use the military to try to put those images around the world saying, do not come here, do not cross here. We will put you in military jets. We'll put you in shackles. We will take you to Gitmo, where we hold some of the worst terror suspects from 9/11 still 25 years later. Trump announced his plan back in January. He was planning to house as many as 30,000 illegal migrants at Gitmo, but only a couple hundred ended up going. And now they've pulled all of them out. The 40 that they had there right now, they've pulled them out. We're waiting to hear more details here, but what we know right now is that the plan has hit a number of legal, logistical, and financial hurdles. You mentioned the cost there, the exorbitant cost of using the military for deportations. They didn't really have a budget for this. They don't really have staffing for this. There's been infighting and responsibility concerns between DHS and DOD. You do this. No, we do this. No, jurisdictionally, we cannot do this. You must do this. Apparently, at Gitmo, they were building a whole bunch of tents. The military was, because they didn't want to be blamed for not having the facilities for these folks to come. The issue is they never got specifics on how to build these tents and what was required of these tents from DHS. These tents that they put up across Guantanamo, they lack air conditioning, they lack running water, they don't meet ICE standards for detention. Under long-standing court settlements, judges have ruled here that we have to adhere to certain humanitarian standards, even when holding illegal migrants here in the country. And so none of these tents were built up to par, built up to standard. Again, the military is like, DHS didn't tell us what we need to do here. We built them like we do in the military, our tents. And so these first migrants showed up at Gitmo. They couldn't put them in the tents. DHS sent one staffer initially to oversee detention operations. The military tried to fill the gap here. Just a lot of finger pointing. We've mentioned that one of the reasons ICE is behind in deportations, Trump is very frustrated right now because deportations are running pretty much on pace with Biden. That's because they lack staffing, lack judges. And so ICE leadership needs what they have of the agents to oversee the deportations and the raids in various cities. So they didn't really have many to send to Guantanamo. So this whole plan, announced a couple months ago, appears to be a sort of DOA right now. And we'll see if they revive it in some way, shape, or form. But Jill, they're going to have to go to Congress and get funding for this sort of thing, because you mentioned some of the costs. That money burns up pretty quickly.
Yes, not sure what Doge would think about that.
Doesn't really fall under government efficiency there, at least not as not the way it's been rolled out so far.
From TechCrunch, next week, Meta will begin one of the company's most significant overhauls ever for how it fact-checks information on its platforms. On Monday, Meta will start testing its version of Community Notes for Facebook, Instagram, and Threads users in the United States. The program copies a crowdsourced fact-checking system that Twitter, now X, unveiled in 2021. It basically lets anyone fact check a post. Meta executives say they're focused on getting community notes right in the United States before it rolls the feature out to other countries. Moshe, a lot of companies test products out in other markets that perhaps aren't as big. But in this case, with tech laws, the rules in Europe are so much stricter than they are in the United States. So it's hard for Meta to test anything out there.
Yeah, especially when it comes to fact checking and misinformation, Meta they actually continue to employ outside fact checkers there while they kill the fact checking program here in the US and have gone to this community idea where we're all fact checkers. So what they're doing right now is they're going to take X's algorithm. It's open source, but they say they're going to plan to build on it. They're going to learn from it, and they're going to customize it for Instagram, for Facebook, for Threads to ensure it works in the Meta world. Jill, I was on a briefing about this earlier this week. They're very proud to announce that they have several 100,000 people who've already applied to be contributors here. Basically, as long as you're over the age of 18, have a verified phone number, there's a way for all of you to apply to become a community notes contributor here on the Meta platforms. Eventually, you'll be able to submit notes on all forms of content, including Meta's executives, like you can community note Zuckerberg at some point, and politicians, other public figures, the same way that it works over on X. Now, one notable thing, once you get a community note on your post, and this is a question I had, from Mo News, if people put a community note on us, fact checking us, though, Jill, we pride ourselves on always having context and facts, but, at the end of the day, this is going to give you the opportunity to sort of treat social media like Wikipedia, where everybody has an ability to contribute and to fact check here. And notably, on posts with community notes, you can't appeal the community note, but there is no additional penalty if your post is flagged. There are concerns here that this could be exploited by large groups or organizations with their own agendas if they want to target certain organizations or certain individuals with community notes to hurt their brand or mislead folks. And so we'll see how this experiment works out. Again, for the most part, when I like going to X, and when I see a post, I'm like, wait, that doesn't seem right. And then I'll scroll down and see a community note that somebody's actually fact checked that. It's always nice to see. So we'll see how this works on these platforms, which are not insignificant, right? Ultimately, Instagram's got 2 billion users around the world. So we'll see how this rolls out and if it ends up being useful to the users.
And Moshe, let's end on this heartwarming story from ABC News. Competing on Jeopardy has been a long time coming for Harvey Solokovitz, an attorney from New Jersey. He first auditioned in 2001, and this week he finally made it to the Jeopardy stage. He told host Ken Jennings about his 24-year journey to appearing on the show. He was diagnosed with Parkinson's back in 2019, but he was not going to let that stop him.
I wouldn't recommend that as a preparation strategy for doing well on the show. But after living with Parkinson's for 5.5 years, it's no longer just about wanting to do well for myself. I would like to give hope and inspiration to the people who are living with chronic illnesses.
Jill, an incredible story here. He went on to win $23,000, just over $23,000 in his first game, breaking an 8-game streak from another contestant. Now, his run did end the next day when another contestant succeeded him, but he was able to win one game. Silikovitz telling CNN in an interview that just being a Jeopardy champion is something that I'm proud of. But the important thing is that even though I had Parkinson's, I didn't give up my dream. And more generally, I tried not to let it define me or stop me from doing the things that I'm passionate about. Notable here, apparently the gentleman got a call from Jeopardy in 2019. It went to voicemail, but by the time he checked his voicemail, it was too late. And so thankfully, 6 years later, by the time they called back, he had a chance to live out his dream there on Jeopardy.
Moshe, I watched a couple of stories about him, and you can't help but tearing up because it's so inspirational. And I'm sure even more so for people who have Parkinson's or other illnesses. All right, Moshe, it's Friday. Cheers to the freaking weekend. Time for what we're watching, reading, and eating. Kick it off. What are you watching?
So I know it's gotten mixed reviews so far, but I want to check out John Mulaney's new show on Netflix, Everybody's Live. He had an experiment last year in LA, and so they're trying new things when it comes to late night TV over on Netflix. And so as a Mulaney fan, I'm going to give a chance to Everybody's Live this weekend. What are you watching?
Moshe, I'm going to go see this new documentary. It is called October 8th. Deborah Messing is one of the executive producers, and it looks at the rise in anti-Semitism following the October 7th attacks in Israel. So it's in AMC theaters for just 1 week. I heard an interview with Wendy Sachs, who I think is the director of the film, and she talked about just how difficult it was to get the film made in this current climate, and also how difficult it was to get any theater chains to carry it. So again, it's out for just 1 week, and it looks like it's going to be pretty enlightening. What are you reading?
So there's a new book out by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, both very smart individuals. You might know Ezra's podcast and is writing in the New York Times. Derek Thompson, we're a big fan here. He writes for The Atlantic, has a great Twitter account as well as a great podcast. They have a new book out called Abundance. It's effectively a guideline for Democrats on what they've screwed up over the past 50 years and how to fix it, become a party of abundance, they say. So interesting review so far, and given some of the themes we've discussed, some of the conversations we're having, curious as to their ideas for the Democratic Party and then whether the Democrats actually follow through with any of them. Jill, what are you reading?
Speaking of The Atlantic, I am reading an article in The Atlantic called Teens Are Foregoing a Classic Rite of Passage. Fewer young people are getting into relationships. We've talked on this podcast a lot about how childhood and adolescence is so different now than it was from when we were growing up. I'm very curious to see what is going on here.
You're still a few years away from your daughter wanting to date, so you got to get prepared there, right, Jill?
I am, but she actually has a quote-unquote boyfriend. And you know what? It creeps up sooner than you think.
Wait, she's in kindergarten? First grade.
But she's had the same boyfriend again for 2 years.
They're going steady in back
Yes,
in
and they haven't seen each
parlance,
other in
right?
a while. Actually, they did see each other yesterday, but they hadn't seen each other in a while. But it's so cute. They really have a connection. So what are you eating, Moshe?
Alex scheduled a date night for us tonight, Jill. We're going to check out Smithereens, a newish restaurant in New York, New England-style seafood here in New York City. So I will let y'all know on the premium Instagram feed this weekend what we thought of it.
Well, I hope you finish your dish to smithereens, Moshe.
There you go. Jill, what are you eating?
Moshe, there's not much that I love more than a classic diner. And there's an old school diner that's still around that my husband used to go to all the time when he was growing up. It's called Tabby's. And we've been doing a lot of ordering in their Greek salads. So I'm having a Greek salad from Tabby's.
All right. Sounds good. Do you keep the feta on it and the olives?
Everything.
Oh,
Yes.
all right, good. So
do you like to separate? There's not much else on the Greek salad. So
yeah, I like that. Sometimes they
on.
throw the anchovies on the Greek salad. That I can do without. But besides that, I'm a big Kalamata olive guy.
Me too. The more olives, the more feta, the better.
The more feta, the better.
The more feta, the better. Spoken like a true Long Islander. All right, everyone. Hope whatever you're watching, reading, and eating this weekend is a 10. That does it for us. Thank you for listening to the Mo News Podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And review us in the App Store.
And if you miss us, know that with premium, you can get Mo News all weekend long. You know,
Are you eating? Are you eating?
I'm having a mint here.
Is that it? I thought I heard
I'm crunching on a mint. The URL is...
You couldn't wait? We're done in 30
not.
seconds, Moshe.
No, well, I wasn't expecting to say this. I was actually not expecting you to call me on it, Jill. The point that I was getting to, though, is if you miss us this weekend, you want to know what we're up to, you want some insider information, mo.news/no-brainer or mo.news/premium to join premium. Check it out. 2-week trial, and 98.6% of people after the trial, Jill, convert.
It's the weekend coverage. Once you get used to it, once you start getting your questions answered, it's hard to go back.
There you go. And Jill's question always gets answered. She's first in line always.
My questions are insane. My questions are usually like very obnoxious.
Well, I know when I get a question from you. I'm like, oh, like you're like, Moshe, like, has this happened before? I was like, wow, Jill's asking me this question. Like, then we really got to answer it.
I feel so honored. I'm going to start to ask more questions.
You're a VIP premium member, Jill.
All right, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News Podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.